Does range. Some are very close and you can actually just go walking right up to them and still see them in the water. There are some, for example, in Port Washington, that you can go kayaking and just look down and see the shipwrecks down there, just because the depth is not that great for them. So that way you're still able to see it. But big question that is often asked at the Maritime Museum, especially with kids with the education aspect. People ask me quite often, why do we care about shipwrecks? Why are we still studying shipwrecks? Why are we preserving shipwrecks that we have in this sanctuary? Why do we have rules that are protecting these shipwrecks? So there's a few reasons for this. First, these shipwrecks oftentimes were left untouched for decades, if not hundreds of years. In some cases, outside the Great Lakes, a couple hundred years. So anything that was left on by the people that were on it stayed. And they weren't planning on having their ship wrecked in most cases. So it was a very natural how things were left. So organic material is going to be gone. Chances are the people themselves, by the time we get there, are going to be gone. We're not going to find anything like that. But we're going to find other aspects about their lives, other parts that will give us some sort of connection to this past. So we will be able to see how they were actually using some of their tools or what was actually needed on a boat that was going to be doing a certain run. And also, especially in Wisconsin with the Great Lakes, it gives us a great look into see just the history of the Midwest, Wisconsin, how it was expanding. A lot of the ways our families came here to Wisconsin, given if your family came here in the 1800s, was from a boat. You don't often think of it today. Oftentimes you wouldn't even think twice about it. You would just maybe not even give it no thought. But chances are your family did. They came on a boat here to Wisconsin because not only was it the easiest, some cases it was the only option, just because there were no roads that were going to give them a direct path here, and also just quite dangerous. So knowing all the shipwrecks, I wasn't too safe either, but it was a little bit better. So there is a huge connection there to a lot of people, they ended up here, but also just to our maritime past as well. Particularly something that's very big for my maritime past of growing up in Manitowoc is that not only during World War II, we were building the submarines, but prior to that, it was what made the city itself, was having this maritime history, that there was massive shipbuilding that was happening, dry dock that was happening. Actually, that's why we have some of the boats that we do in these areas, is because people were taking their boat to Manitowoc to be dry docked because they knew there was a problem wrong with it and they knew it needed to be fixed, but they waited too long and the boat sunk before they could get there. So that's why we do end up with some of the smaller shipwrecks, is because they knew it was needed to be fixed. They just didn't get it fixed in time. So how are these shipwrecks located? A few different ways. First one, by accident. A lot of these shipwrecks, some, especially dependent on how many people died, will stay in popular culture. It'll be passed on oral history. They will be able to be as many books as possible, just taking the stories of people. But oftentimes they do end up getting forgotten where the ship went down. And because if there were no survivors, it's just kind of the general area. So some of these shipwrecks that are found today are just found by accident, by boaters that are out there. Sonar is another, we'll go through that. We actually just had it 2 or 3 weeks ago in Manitowoc, a mile and a half from the Maritime Museum. A gentleman that had his own sonar machine was just out in the water and found a tugboat that we didn't even locate. So it's still, even just in our own backyard, there's still more ships to be found. ROVs, these are remotely operated vehicles. Even if you don't know what an ROV is or couldn't pick one out, chances are you have seen something, an image that was created by an ROV. ROVs are going to be underwater robots. So any picture you have seen of the Titanic underwater, that was taken by an ROV. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then the researching of primary sources. That is another way that we are able to locate these shipwrecks. So with sonar, just the basic concept of it, this is generally where the maritime archaeologists, their first step for trying to locate these shipwrecks. Just because Lake Michigan or any area, depending on small, can be a lot to cover. And even having an ROV or scuba diving, it just isn't an option. So what they will do is use sonar when then they are able to have images created or maps created, and then they'll able to, studying those maps, narrow down some areas that either they want to research further, or this is a photo actually from the Pacific, where it's very clearly a plane that has gone down. So you know you want to do some additional research there. So this is the first way that they are starting off with locating these shipwrecks. And as I said just a little earlier, that it is something that people just do for hobbies of going out and mapping places that haven't been mapped yet and trying just to see what's there. For the ROVs, see if it works. Here we go. Just so you can see the footage of what it looks like from these ROVs. The ROVs themselves aren't too exciting, but what we can get from them is quite exciting. They can be very small. You can have ROVs that are used for testing water samples, and they can fit into the palm of your hand, whereas ones that are going to be sent for the Titanic are quite large, bigger than the ceiling and wider than my arm span. And they will take these ROVs and go down, and they will use it for places, for example, the Titanic, where people cannot get, or they will use it to go down first before sending down scuba divers, so that they're able to see the conditions there. Also with these ROVs, they are able to take some of the artifacts off. So this is another area, the next step that the maritime archaeologists will take when locating these shipwrecks.
Have they ever found any money on them?
Yes, so that is something that is actually found quite often, will be money. We end up with a lot of coins in the Maritime Museum. So we'll talk about it a little bit later, but I didn't have too much of a slide. In 1987, there was an act passed by the state of Wisconsin, and it was the Abandoned Shipwrecked Act. And what it did is it made it illegal for anyone to take any items off of these shipwrecks, because a lot of the items that we have at the Maritime Museum, they were picked up by scuba divers that just went treasure hunting for fun. They did not have a maritime archaeology background. They were not properly trained in it. Some of them did have a code of ethics that were guiding them when they were grabbing these artifacts. Others did not, and they would take them and sell them. So that is the fact of money. Definitely there's money in it, in the sense of they could take these things and keep it and exchange it in any way they would want, but also just selling it. So ties in nicely to maritime archaeology. Maritime archaeology is the study of cultures with a focus on how these civilizations interacted with their waterways. So this is a fairly new division of archaeology. It is greater than just underwater archaeology, because underwater archaeology can be looking at the sediment of the water area, whereas this Maritime archaeology is focusing more on the acts of maritime activities. So they will also be looking at lighthouses as well, port construction, just anything that is involving that maritime life and culture. But they are the ones that are going in and they are the ones that are studying those shipwrecks. So it is a fairly new discipline. It wasn't the first official maritime archaeology expedition wasn't until 1960. So it's been a couple of years since then, but it's still fairly new. And it wasn't until, again, 1987 that this act came in. So there were quite a few decades where people were able to scuba dive, and the shipwrecks up and down the coast, they were the ones, majority that were locating them. So these were just amateurs that were locating them, and they were taking the artifacts from them. So a lot of the artifacts that we have in the museum are actually from these amateur divers that were just going down and grabbing it. But before we get into the shipwrecks that we'll be looking at today, we'll be looking at 3. Does anyone have any questions so far?
What is your education background to get the job you have, and what would you recommend for someone who was interested in it today? Like what school has the major?
I'm just a smooth talker, just kidding. I went to school for history with just a focus on, just a personal focus on maritime history. But for anyone that is interested, I work with quite a few maritime archaeologists. Some went to school for history, some went to school for archaeology, and for the master's program that's required in the state of Wisconsin, there is one at UW-Madison as well as UW-Milwaukee, but everyone, if you meet a maritime archaeologist, chances are they went to East Carolina University, ECU, they all go to ECU. There's a million of them and they all go to ECU. So that is a very big maritime archaeology school. A part of that is because of the sanctuaries that are there. There are quite a few just Civil War history, World War I, World War II, of just along the coast, that there is just a lot there. But fantastic question. Any other questions? Yeah.
I think this is very important, and I think, like you said, there's more involved than just recreation and knowing. It's a matter of how did we react back then, and what was the traffic and what was the commerce like. So, is what you were doing, are you feeling any of what the government is tightening up on grants and stuff like that? Are we feeling it in Wisconsin?
So I have someone in my office that is from NOAA, and they definitely are. Yes. They are definitely feeling the pressure of grants being cut. We are feeling it as well, of just some levels of uncertainty that are just unfortunately the norm in our industry right now. Yeah. Okay, so the first boat we'll be talking about today is the Niagara. It was built in 1845 and it was built in New York City. At the time, the Niagara was the boat. It was called a palace steamer. I'm gonna pull up my notes, excuse me. That's fun little facts to make sure I included those. And palace steamer was one of them. So it was built in 1845. It could fit upwards of 300 people. And it was making the trip from Buffalo, New York, and coming to Chicago, but making about 75 stops in between. So there you could either be coming from Buffalo and you were either going to Chicago or one of the stops along the way. Milwaukee was very much up and coming in this time period, but they would fit about 75 first-class passengers that would be in the cabins.
And then the rest underneath would be underneath in steerage. Those that were in steerage, oftentimes those were immigrants that were coming to Wisconsin. They had come through Ellis Island, done the processing there. Well, not Ellis Island yet because of the time period, but they had traveled to the United States. They had gone through, at this period of time, it would have taken a couple weeks to cross the Atlantic, then had gone up the Hudson, through the Erie Canal, and then getting on another boat to come to Wisconsin. So a great trip was being made by these immigrants trying to come here to come to Wisconsin. But this boat, it was steam paddle, so it was pretty new and pretty fancy because it could go a lot faster than other boats. So it was quite popular. But on September 24th, 1856, a fire was discovered in the ship's hold. They were just north of Port Washington when this happened. And Congressman John B. Macy of Fond du Lac County was actually on the boat, but did not survive. He actually has a very sad story and not one I'm imagining he would like to be remembered, but the story is that he was trying to get onto a boat, jumped over the side, ended up hitting the lifeboat and capsizing that boat and then dying. Yeah, so not the best story there. But it was a tragic thing. They don't know still to this day. They know what the fire started in the hold, but we're not sure as to why the fire started. 60 passengers and crew did not survive. And today the Niagara sits in 55 feet of water. So I'll start showing some of the artifacts from it. But the reason I picked some of the boats that I did today is because of 3D prints that we were able to get at the museum. So the underwater, the maritime archaeologists, what they will do is they will take tons of photos when they're under the water and studying these ships. Then they will use a special software that will put all of these images together so they can create 3D renderings. So then we can have these 3D prints that are made of the wreck sites. So very interesting way to be able to show people what they look like. So I'll pass this around. And don't worry about breaking anything. Generally, I am showing this to little kids and they've broken off every little part that could be broken. So this is what the wreck site looks now. There, you can't really make out much in terms of the hull shape. You can see the paddles, what used to be, and then the bar connecting them. But otherwise, the Niagara, there is not much that I would say distinguishes it as a boat, other than just some rubble. This is the photogrammetry. That is when they're taking all those photos and mushing them all together. This is what it will look like. So that way they're able to have it, that if they can't send someone down to scuba dive, they'll be able to do this. Or like some of the people that came from Eastern Carolina University, they do not like diving in Lake Michigan because it's always too cold. They complain about it all the time. Yeah, they complain about it all the time. It's too cold. They will not go diving in Wisconsin, but they love to study the ships. They just don't want to go down to that. Another part that they always tell me to point out is that the photography that you can get in Lake Michigan makes it look like it is very clear and very easy to see these shipwrecks. Niagara is a little bit different, that it is only in 55 feet of water, but generally for these other shipwrecks, even though we can see it clearly, they cannot see it clearly. You have to get very close when you are doing these dives to look at these wrecks because of just, there's no light down there. You provide your own light. It only provides so much. And just because of the clarity of the water, you do need to get very, very close. But these are some parts of the remnants. This is parts of the paddle that once was. And you can see that with all of these shipwrecks, they are being reclaimed by nature in some capacity. So the unique part of the shipwrecks that are in the Great Lakes in comparison to the Titanic, these are preserved just because of the body of water that it is. It is cold, fresh water, whereas, yes, the Titanic is in very, very cold water, but it's in salt water. So it's slowly eating away at the Titanic. It is guessed that the estimate is that in 30 years, the Titanic will be gone. So they have put a real priority on sending down those ROVs. They've actually been able to take a photo of every inch of the Titanic to create a full 3D rendering of it. It took about 2 weeks, working 24 hours to get every photo. We do not have that time constraint with these shipwrecks, which is quite unique, so they are able to be preserved. Here are some of the artifacts coming from the shipwrecks. So when you have a maritime archaeologist, they are going to be studying the wreck as well. They're not just going to take those primary sources that said there was a fire and take that at complete word. They want to find proof of it within the artifacts. So with this is a very big artifact for proving or confirming that there was a fire because of the bell, the damage to it. You can see in some areas that the bell was melting. So it would need to be a very high heat point for that to happen. Yes,
Isn't there a rope attached to the bell?
that's us. Yeah. Well, not us, actually, that's someone else, but that's a whole other story. Those amateur, some of the artifacts that we have are from the amateur divers. Yeah. We have people that are going through right now still because there are so many boxes that were not categorized correctly, so things weren't preserved the way they should have been. But the bell is one thing that adds the confirmation of the fire. There are other metal products that have the same damage as well. But we do have other artifacts like these ice skates. This is one I generally point out to the kids just to remind people that these were, in a lot of cases, a lot of immigrants that were coming to Wisconsin. They were on the last leg of their journey to come to their new homeland, Germany or not Germany, I'm just saying Germany because of Wisconsin. But Europe in the 1800s, there was conflicts everywhere, famine fighting, things were just horrible. These people were taking a massive trip, going through so much, a long trip to come and start this new world, this new life in the new world, bringing along their ice skates, and unfortunately never did get to use them. And then another artifact is we have a lot of jewelry from the Niagara as well that has been found, because a lot of these things you can think of, well, why didn't someone just go and claim it if they survived? These artifacts were not lifted until the 60s or 70s. So that was over 100 years after the ship had already gone down. And then the big artifact that very much confirmed that there was fire was just the timber had the burn marks on it. Again, confirming that there was in fact a fire, adding to just the physical support to those newspapers. But I'll just go back to show the wreck as well. So this boat would have been able to fit 300 people. So very, very big. And this is all that is left now, sitting just north of Port Washington. Then the next boat that we will be talking about is not one that is in our maritime or our marine sanctuary here in Wisconsin. It is actually in another maritime sanctuary. It is in Thunder Bay. I have a 3D print of it, and it was built in Manitowoc, so I felt it was good enough I could pull it in for this one. So this is the Cornelia B. Winnite. It was built by a Wisconsin man or a Manitowoc man in Manitowoc. It was a 3 wooden schooner, 3 masts, and now it is in Lake Huron. So this
boat, when it was built, he named it after his daughter Cornelia B. And it was intended to carry bushels. It was going to be carrying bushels of grain to the East Coast. At the period of time, there was a lot of grain that was coming out of the Midwest being sent on the Great Lakes to the East Coast. So they were trying to get in on that market. This is what it looks like now at the bottom of Lake Huron. So once the 3D print gets to you, or you'll see it up here, this ship looks a lot different than Niagara. It still has the hull shape to it. You'll be able to see distinguishing areas. You'll be able to see the lifeboat that was attached to it. And you can see it on the
What's
side.
the material of the hull?
Oh,
Is it metal?
oh no, so the hull material would have been wood.
Oh.
Yeah, and then you'll see on the side here, this is the lifeboat. So you can get just perspective of how massive this schooner was, given how small the lifeboat is on the 3D print. This is quite unique as well, this shipwreck, in that the grain is still on the boat. It is broken down, being in the water for quite some years, but it is still there for the archaeologists. So this is one of the photos of the archaeologists looking at it. You can still make out the shape of the ship, just entirely different looking than you have in comparison to the Niagara, which has no real distinguishing features. The helm is still visible. The lifeboat landing right next to them. Really, you can see it. It looks the exact same. The very unique part about this ship is that when it, I will say in a second why the boat went down, but when it did go down, the mass did not collapse. So underwater, all three masts are still standing. So it's very unique in that not many boats have their masts still standing. And especially in comparison, all three still standing. But this is one where they were not able to break it down by looking at the boat itself at all. So they looked at the boat, there was no obvious damage. The hull is still in great condition, even with going down and being at the bottom of Lake Huron. It is still in very good condition, and it was sitting for decades before it was found by the archaeologists. They actually didn't even think it was in Lake Huron. They thought this boat was still in Lake Michigan, because they didn't believe it went past Mackinac Island yet. So with these cases, just because of the time period, they were not able to actually say when these boats went down, or you couldn't tell anyone. It just, they didn't make it where they needed to be. So with this boat, they had left Milwaukee on November 27th, 1875. So it was a very late season run, end of November. And a ship of this size should have been able to carry 16,000 bushels of grain. They were carrying 21,000 bushels of grain. So that extra weight was already working against them. There was a real push because there was a lot of grain coming out of the Midwest just to capitalize on it as much as possible and to try to have this late season run, and also just to put more on than you'd like to see. You'll see that this is a common theme. I'll discuss it in the next as well, of how risks were made on behalf of the crew to try to capitalize on things, putting their lives at risk to try to make more money. And unfortunately, these men did not make it through. They didn't make it through with these risks. So they had more weight on them, And then there was a bad storm that came through the area. So they believe that with the snow, the ice, the waves coming down, and the fact that the boat was already sitting lower in the water, that it basically just kind of slipped under the water and then just gracefully went to the bottom of the lake, just because of the condition that it's in. We'll see a similar story with our next boat, and that they're able to see the damage of how it went down just because of the force of how it went down. This one is in such great condition that it's often discussed at anytime that there is any sort of ghost ship meeting. They get together sometimes and have festivals. This is one that is always discussed, because when they went and found the boat, it had been enough time that there were no bodies found either. So they couldn't find the crew. So it looked like the ship was just completely abandoned. So this is one of them that's a very popular ghost ship because of the condition it's being in, the mast still being there, quite eerie, and then also just having no remnants of the crews just really adds to the spookiness of it. So before we move on to our final boat, does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Who makes the call on, like, the iron ore coming out of Duluth and Superior on Lake Superior or Lake Michigan today? Who makes the final call on, okay, that's the end of shipping for this season? And that's got to vary from year to year because the weather is different, but who makes that call?
At this time period, it was the shipping companies, the companies that owned it. Yeah, and we'll see with our next one, it was a private owner. The man himself had owned it. He was also the captain of the ship, and he made the call that they were going to go out. And just being on the, especially during this time period, it's a little bit different now, but this time period, going in November at any point, it would be horrifying, just because we all know with living here, you can have a completely normal day and then 6 inches of snow the next day. And given that the instruments, the technology that they had was so minuscule at the time, there was just such a risk of going along with maritime, just anything related, boat related. And that's why with trying to get, one of the hardest parts I have with being an educator with younger kids, especially like kindergarten, first grade, is trying to get them to understand that the safeguards that we have today, your phone alerts you that there's a bad storm coming, or the radar or the sirens going off because there's a thunderstorm having. All of those things are new. They were not around at that time. There was no phones for you to be able to contact people. That just so much technology has advanced so much that we don't see these wrecks. So something like the Edmund Fitzgerald stands out so much because a wreck of that size hadn't happened for decades, and it was just something so out of the norm that just grasped curiosity. Whereas it's just not as common anymore, just thankfully because of some rules and regulations and also just better technology. But ultimately, especially in this time period, it was just to make that bottom dollar. That's all. The priority was just making that money. This one, I don't know the exact number for this one. I believe it was about 20, but this crew wasn't too big. Yes, yeah. So for a 3-mast schooner now, something like a sailboat of this size, you could probably sail it with 6 people. Something very small, knowing that's, again, with modern technology, but ultimately things are pretty similar in terms of sailing, that you don't need a large crew for these boats, which was kind of the benefit for them. Yes.
Were these owned by shipping companies, 2 owned by shipping companies? Did they have other boats?
So this one was owned by a private gentleman, and the first one was owned by a company. It was 2 gentlemen. They had a company out of Buffalo. Yeah. So that's also the kind of the mix of it, that it wasn't just private people. They were making the decisions for themselves. They were on the boats. oftentimes for the first two, these men, they were not, people making the calls were not on the boats. The next one is a bit different though.
So when they were making these calls, like, was there an oversight agency that said, well, here's your standards that you have? Like, were there no codes there?
No, yeah, that's also something that just our minor mindset of you have OSHA for to make some protections, to make sure some things don't happen. And just that they didn't have to put their crew's safety as like a high priority in any way. Yeah, it's really, that's the hard part of discussing shipwrecks is it's cool. It's cool. I don't have to, I think, argue with anyone by saying that learning about shipwrecks is very interesting. It's very unique and it's so close, so you feel a bit of a connection to it. But there is such a dark aspect of it that you have to remember of just that studying of these shipwrecks isn't just studying the shipwreck itself, but also the people that were on it, their story as well, because it's so important because you can kind of lose the image of it or the whole idea if you just focus on the cool stuff. It is important to remember those people as well. Any other questions? Fantastic. Okay. The final ship that we'll be talking about today is the Rouse Simmons. Some of you might be familiar with this ship and not even know it. It is the Christmas tree ship. So this ship was built in 1868. So it did not sink until 1912. That is a very long time for a schooner to be going. So that's something to keep in mind when we're discussing the risks that people were taking for taking some of these boats out. This boat was already was out of fashion. It wasn't typical at this point anymore to be having those 3-mast schooners. Technology was advancing, but also just the life of the schooner itself. Generally, you don't see it that they are making it this long. So the Rouse Simmons, it was a Christmas tree ship. They would go up to Thompson, Michigan, cut down the trees themselves, and then bring it down to Chicago. Different than other wholesale vendors is that they did not sell to a wholesaler. They sold it themselves. So they would dock on Water Street and then they would put up Christmas lights and people would come up and buy the Christmas trees from them. The captain, who is also the owner of the ship, he was known as Captain Santa. People really liked him in Chicago. They would very much viewed him affectionately. That he was known for selling Christmas trees. First off, why people liked him is because there was no middleman. He was able to keep the prices very low. And also he was known to give Christmas trees to those that could not afford one. So it was nice in that regard. He is quite in the maritime world, I would say a polarizing figure because there were these nice things. But then in terms of boat maintenance, he was putting his crew at great risk by going out and making these trips. So this was another trip that was being made in late November. It was November 22nd, and they were making a late trip back from Michigan, and they were in Two Rivers. So just a little bit north of where we are at the Wisconsin Maritime Museum. And they were coming back from, they were loaded with trees, and they did have a bit more than they should have. So the boat was, again, already staying a little bit lower than it should have. Also in terms of boat maintenance. So when you have a schooner, especially a wooden schooner, it's not easy to see, but these are boards, each one. And what they will do in between is something that we have today, just caulking. At the time, what it was is they would put cotton in between,
and then use some sort of compound to seal it. And that was because the boards could not be perfectly adjacent to one another, so this was to prevent any sort of leaking. The caulking on the Rouse Simmons had not been done for a while. It needed to be updated. So this is kind of the polarizing aspect of he was taking a late trip, was not maintaining his boat the way he should have been, and this hull was already quite old. So it is something very important to keep in mind with this story are those important facts. So this is just a drawing. Unfortunately, this one I don't have a 3D print, but I like to include the Rouse Simmons because it's a Christmas tree ship. Everyone likes that one. But this one is quite different than the previous ship we were talking about, the Winnite, in that when it went down, it still has the hull shape to it, but there is a fair amount of damage to the deck. So it's unclear as if this damage happened when it was going down, just the force of it hitting. That is what archaeologists are leaning towards. That because of the storm itself, because we'll talk about it in a moment. The top photo is just an aerial view, and then the bottom right is actually what it looks like on for sonar. So that is what it will look like when they are doing those maps and trying to get the depth. This is what they will get images that look like, and from there they'll know to narrow it down a bit more. But you can just see what it looks like in comparison to the other boat that we looked at. Whereas the Winnite was still the hull in very good condition. You had nature reclaiming it, otherwise the masts were still standing. Whereas this, you can see damage to the hull already. The deck just having things thrown about. Just a nice comparison as to how they can look, that they do vary. Because with the Rouse Simmons, what it is happened is they were coming back from Thompson, Michigan. When they were near Kewanee, it was seen at the life-saving station that the Rouse Simmons was flying their flag upside down, which is a way to say that they were in distress. At the time, there was a very strong storm that was coming through. Knowing this is said in hindsight, but still, locals said it was the worst storm they had ever seen. So they were dealing with waves, snow, and rain, or just water, all of it. And you're already doing this with a schooner that should not be going, and also just is not well maintained at all. So it wasn't just even the crew of the Rouse Simmons that was there. They actually had a few lumberjacks with them as well that they had taken from Thompson. The captain had said, like, yeah, you guys can join us. We're going down to Chicago. These men had family that they were going back to Chicago to see. They were going to spend the rest of the holidays down there with them. And unfortunately, they never made it. But the Rouse Simmons was spotted by that life-saving station. They were able, just given the time period, it was 1912, they were able to make a call to Two Rivers, which would be the next big city beneath them. And Two Rivers, they got in their boat, which was motorized at the time, so they were going at a decent speed. They went out to where the Rouse Simmons should have been, about 5 miles out, and the boat was not there. So they came back. They thought, okay, maybe they just missed us. Turns out later on, they believed they were just on top of where the Rouse Simmons was, because at that point it had already gone under. So this is another example of just the November storms, just taking another boat. And this one in particular just caused a lot of damage on its way down just because of the storm itself.
But some of the artifacts from the Christmas tree ship. So obviously a lot of Christmas trees were on there. The condition that they are in now is that very few have their needles still attached. There are a few that still have some that are still clinging on, but mostly they have all fallen. You'll have there's a lot of equipment for cutting down trees that was on the boat as well as light bulbs. So these light bulbs, actually, when dried out, they were able to still use them. They were able to plug it in and it was able to be used, which is incredible. But these were the light bulbs that they would plug in once they got to Water Street. There's no electricity on the schooner, but once they got down to Water Street, this was part of it that made them kind of a big to-do in Chicago, and everyone really enjoyed seeing them, and people said they looked like an ornament themselves because of how dressed up they were, is part of one of the artifacts that is found with the boat. So what has already been discussed, just that November 22nd was the last time that the Rouse Simmons was seen before going under. Christmas trees are still put out for the dives, and it is a quite popular dive. I don't think it's something that people think about a lot, but in Manitowoc, we do get a decent amount of scuba divers that are just tourists that want to go diving to these wrecks, and they want to just go down and look at them. You can go to any scuba site or any of these sites. They do put the information online so people can go and see them. You're just not able to take anything from them. Part of the sanctuary will allow you to go there and just leave it how it is. But that is it for my presentation.